Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on Decolonizing Philanthropy, organised by Alliance Magazine in partnership with Mercer. I am Andrew Milner, a freelance writer and researcher and the features editor of Alliance, and I'll also be your moderator for today's discussion. The discussion also marks the launch of Alliance's September issue on the same topic, and we're very lucky to have with us today contributors to the issue among our panelists. Before we hear from speakers, let me just say a brief word about the format for the event. We're going to run for an hour. Each of the panelists will make a sort of short presentation, 5 minutes or so. Then we'll have a question and answer session, which will open to everyone. We invite all of you to take part in it. If you want to ask a question, you can do so anytime using the chat function on the right, probably the right, but not in every case, of your screen. It's very easy. Just click on it and ask your question, as we're all very familiar with these platforms now, I'm sure. We'll keep an eye on that throughout the webinar, and we'll be selecting questions to put to the panelists during the Q&A. When you ask a question, please tell us who you are and where you're from. Time's obviously limited, but we'll do our best to put as many of them as we can to the panel. You can also join the conversation on Twitter if you're a tweeter, using the handle @AllianceMag and the hashtag Decolonizing Philanthropy. I should also draw your attention to a special offer we're running today. Everyone on the webinar is welcome to subscribe to Alliance at a 20% discount using the code EVENT22. There's a link again to this in the chat. Subscription means you'll receive the 4 print issues of the magazine we publish annually, including the most recent issue on Decolonizing Philanthropy, and access to our online content, news, interviews, op-eds, etc. We're also delighted to have with us today, as a sponsor for today's event, Mercer. We've got with us Connor Power of Mercer. Connor's the principal of Mercer's investment business, leading the non-profits practice for Europe. Connor, welcome. Would you just perhaps say a word or two about who Mercer is and what their interest is in the topic?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andrew. I'm delighted to be here and to be able to help with the event. So Mercer is a global investment firm. We work a lot with not-for-profit institutions who are very much interested in philanthropy in its various different forms. And I personally work with several of those throughout Europe. The purpose of today, as you'll know, in terms of the webinar topic, it's extremely interesting. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the speakers. One ask from me, from the Mercer perspective, is that via our not-for-profit business, we do work with not-for-profits all over the globe. And we very recently released a survey that was taken part by 150 different not-for-profits globally on issues such as impact and sustainability and other interesting relevant topics. That's available via the Alliance website, and it's also available via the Mercer website. So I'd encourage any not-for-profits that are listening in to go and check that out. But I won't take up any further of the time, and with that I'll hand back over to Andrew and the speakers, and I'm looking forward to hearing the debate.
Thanks, Connor. That's great. That survey sounds really interesting. I encourage anybody to go and have a look at that. Okay, let's get into the debate itself. Over the past few years, the term decolonizing philanthropy has come to prominence. But what does it mean? Does it only apply to those places where there's a legacy of European settlement imposed on a non-European population? Or should it be understood more widely as dismantling the assumptions that underlie the relationships between a dominant social group and the rest of society? How should philanthropy be decolonized? Should it be making reparations? If so, to whom? Should it be altering its own practices? If so, how? Which organizations and philanthropists are at the forefront of these developments? What needs to happen to make decolonized philanthropy a reality? Is it an important step in the future development of philanthropy or a 9-days wonder? These are among some of the questions we're hoping to try and unpick in this webinar on the topic today. As I noted at the start, we've got a stellar panel with us to discuss these questions. Besides the 2 guest editors of the special feature, Urvi Shiram of the Indian School of Development Management and Shonali Banerjee, we've got Yvonne Moore of Moore Philanthropies in the US and Jessica Sklair of Queen Mary University London. So let me, without more ado, bring in the first panelist, who's Dr. Shonali Banerjee, Senior Research Associate at the Centre for Strategic Philanthropy at the Judge Business School in Cambridge, leading the Centre's research agenda on philanthropy in global growth markets, specifically Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. Before this, Shonali served as Research Development Officer at Queen Mary University, where she worked with faculty across all disciplines to develop proposals for the Global Challenges Research Fund. She's an expert in global philanthropy for development, and her previous work focused on the implications of new financial instruments in philanthropy and giving. Prior to academia, Shonali worked as a development practitioner, spending 5 years with international organizations in the US, Morocco, Thailand, and Cambodia. Her book, Horizontal Development, Shifting Power and Privilege in Aid, has been published by Bristol University Press. She sits on the advisory committee for the L'Oreal Fund for Women. Shonali, welcome. Just tell us first of all about your work and how sort of decolonizing philanthropy plays into that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Andrew. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you, certainly on behalf of Urvi and myself, to Alliance Magazine for inviting us to be guest editors on this special feature. As you know, I will share this is an issue very close to not only to my heart, but to the heart and core of the Center for Strategic Philanthropy at Cambridge. So I think I'll just start a little bit, like Andrew said, about what is our interest, my personal interest in studying decolonizing philanthropy and the interest of the center. So our center was launched only just under 2.5 years ago, and so when we set out creating a research agenda for an academic center, one of the things that we really wanted to focus on was not just creating an academic research agenda that has no real industry relevance, because that happens too often, especially in a field like this, philanthropy. Our center specifically looks at philanthropy in global growth markets, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. So we wanted to make sure that we had voices from those core markets, contribute to the development of our research agenda. So as I'll mention, I'll get into it a little bit during my discussion. These issues around decolonizing philanthropy came up time and time again in a variety of ways as we were running focus groups, as we were doing interviews, as we've been hosting convenings around the Shift the Power theme in philanthropy, which is particularly focused on shifting power from the so-called global north to the so-called global south, but also the ways that, decolonization of philanthropy and power manifests itself even within global south context. It's not just a north-south debate. So it really was, it was almost something that we couldn't ignore, we didn't want to ignore. And so we've now woven decolonizing philanthropy, completely entrenched it in our research agenda, and it's sort of a guiding kind of a guiding principle of all we have been doing and all we will be doing going forward. So I hope that, I'm really looking forward to this discussion and hearing from members in the audience today, about their thoughts, their interests, so that we can continue moving this forward.
Great, thanks. Let me just sort of, you mentioned about it's not just a north-south debate. How do you see attitudes being perpetuated in sort of what you might call indigenous philanthropy, which would you describe as colonial? And how's that working, do you think?
Sorry, you say I missed one little bit of you there, Andrew. Is it mostly about the it's not just a north-south debate?
Exactly. I wonder how you see those attitudes that you might think as colonial being reproduced in indigenous philanthropy or domestic philanthropy.
Absolutely. I think this is such an important issue because, it is really, really crucial, certainly as we have found in our research and our data collection at the center, that, it is really easy to, because so it's kind of in the name, decolonizing philanthropy. It's, this idea that the former colonizers perhaps still hold all the power. And in a lot of ways, they absolutely do. I mean, if we look at global surveys on philanthropy done by organizations like the OECD, you can see that in terms of the capital flows, the funding flows, a huge majority of the capital is still flowing from the global north to the global south. So my aim is certainly not to be dismissive of how imbalanced that power structure is, but something that is of great interest to us at the center, and like I said, because our focus is very much on philanthropy in these global growth markets, is how, let's say, donor organizations, philanthropists themselves, high net worth individuals, large large CSR funds or family office foundations based in these emerging markets, how are they actually practicing philanthropy? In a lot of cases, they are bringing, kind of indigenous values, traditional values to the way that they practice philanthropy. However, in a lot of cases, what we see is that they are, at times trying to emulate what they see as Western best practice in philanthropy. And, perhaps they have, they have taken advice from Western firms. Perhaps they, are educated and trained in the West. Perhaps they, if they're, family office heads or come from, if it's a corporate social responsibility fund, perhaps their businesses are being modeled on Western best practice. So these connections can definitely be made. And so we shouldn't dismiss the idea that even, wealth holders and philanthropists and practitioners in the so-called global South are actually, still recreating some of these potentially unhelpful, potentially damaging practices. And so I think that's where, and I'm sure others on the panel today will also elaborate their own perspectives on this from their own work. So if I have, just a minute or two left, I want to give a small case study, a small example of this that was very, very well revealed in a September 2021 report from our colleagues at CAPSI in South Africa, and I believe some CAPSI colleagues are here today. So this was a report funded by the Vodafone Foundation, the Race and Philanthropy report, which was done by CAPSI and colleagues at Clearview Research here in the UK. And one of the things that report revealed, it was about the barriers to philanthropy and civil society organizations in Africa. And one of the things that was revealed in that report was around how, in an effort to sort of quasi decolonize themselves or quasi localize themselves, you see situations where huge international funders, huge international bodies, be they philanthropic bodies, institutional funders, et cetera, where they open up local offices in countries in Africa or large cities, kind of regional headquarters, et cetera. And what ends up happening is that you still end up with a lot of the funding perhaps flowing from a head office in the global north, rather than being distributed to local organizations and, community-based organizations, capacity building organizations on the ground. Now, a lot of that funding is flowing to, that organization's local office or regional hub. And what also ends up, so that funding is not getting distributed the way it needs to. And then what happens is that in a lot of cases, those organizations, when they open up those country offices or regional hubs, they are actually pulling staff and talent away from local organizations. Because, perhaps they can, this large organization can pay better salaries, they have a big, very recognizable brand name. So what's happening is that, the most, kind of competent, the most, kind of well-connected, well-entrenched people at smaller, community-based or localized organizations are actually moving away and trying to get jobs at these regional hubs. So this is just, a small case study, a small example of, trying to think, an organization, a big organization is trying to think, oh, you know what? We don't need to be based in Washington, D.C. We don't need to be based in London. We shouldn't be based in Paris. We need to be, but rather than finding ways to actually really, really, kind of entrench themselves with community partners or local partners, they're actually, they're going halfway and they're not quite getting it right. And I think this is probably, a lot of us can probably think of examples where this has happened. So I think that's where, to go back to your question, Andrew, around, are there instances where it's not just about North-South, that these are South-South issues too around decolonization. This is a perfect example where it all comes full circle, that it was a North-South issue, and then it became a South-South issue because the decolonization did not go quite right. The localization did not go quite right. And so I'm very happy to share our recent report and also this this CAPSI and Clearview Research report I'll pop the links into the chat, you know, in a few minutes, just so that everyone, you know, has a reference to what I'm speaking about here. But I mean, I hope that that maybe, you know, kicks things off a little bit, because I think a lot of the issues that even Alliance, you know, that you all have talked about in some of your recent editorials, this all fits together: trust-based philanthropy, localizing philanthropy. It all has to do with power. It all has to do with, you know, decolonizing mentalities, et cetera. So I very much look forward to the discussion. You know, I hope everyone who has been able to read the special feature, you know, enjoyed all the different contributions, including the one from Urvi and myself, and really looking forward to advancing this dialogue further.
Great. You mentioned the key word there, power. I'm sure we'll have more to say about that during the rest of the debate. Let me now turn to Yvonne Moore. Yvonne is Chief Executive and founder of Moore Philanthropies, a Black-founded and woman-led advisory firm whose mission is to reverse the lack of investment in communities of colour by ensuring that change makers can access the support of financial tools to create change and build generational wealth. She's got over 25 years experience in government, civil society and philanthropy, and has built strong relations with government officials, with grassroots organisations and community advocates, and successfully co-developed projects in the most challenging environments, including post-conflict and slum communities, and most recently in the 2014 Ebola outbreak in Liberia. And she's got wide experience in issues which include economic security, anti-violence and safety, alternative energies, water, sanitation and hygiene, education, health, and organisational sustainability and management. Yvonne, you're very welcome. From your point of view, you were coming at a slightly different position from say, from Urvi and from Shonali, coming from an academic point of view, and they're also working often in areas where the colonizers have left. But in the US, you've got what they call settler colonialism, which means you've still got a sort of a dominant majority of people who've come from overseas that have taken over. How does that play into your work? If I think you might be muted, actually.
So this is actually the saying that continues. You're on mute. I apologize. So thank you, Andrew, so much. And I'm so excited to find out how many people wanted to join today. You know, it's, I mean, my heart started beating fast, Shonali, when you were talking, because first of all, I so appreciated the research that you and Urvi did, because it's the basis for which people need to begin their work. You know, I was also reading the article by Mullman in this issue, and I would encourage everyone to get it. I think one of the things that folks need to understand is that you have to understand where it begins, right? If you're going to actually solve the problem, you need to understand the history. You need to understand where it comes from if you're going to decolonize or undo. Right, that's actually what we're talking about, is undoing behaviors. You know, one of the things I thought about, and Andrew, I'm like off on a riff because I've completely and totally forgotten your question. What actually did you ask me again?
I was just asking.
I could talk about this all day.
I was just asking how sort of decolonization played out in the US context, where you've got settler colonialism, where the sort of colonial minority
exactly
are still there.
Right, it's very much still here. It's right. It's the genocide, basically, of Native Americans. It's the enslavement of African Americans, and it's now the power structure that exists. Right. When I talk about decolonization, I try to break it up into 3 buckets so folks can kind of understand. And power, right? It's I talk about language, power, and behavior. Right. Those are the kind of the 3 things. And I really appreciated, again, the article that Shonali and Urvi did, because it gave some of the background that you needed. I think one of the things that's so important is, you know, we talk about, you know, Edgar's work has been phenomenal, but when I, you know, in the practice of philanthropy, so Moore Philanthropy is an advisory firm, and we actually worked with donors on their giving. Right, directly on their giving, with their working on their strategy. How are you going to deploy? How are you going to, you know, think about your strategy? How do you want to give? And one of the things that we're constantly working with folks is what folks now call trust-based philanthropy. Right, that's how I entered into philanthropy. That's actually the other thing too, right, is that as a Black American woman, there was this assumption when I came into institutional philanthropy that I had no idea what I was doing, right? So, but I learned philanthropy from my family. I learned it from my mother and my father, right? Traditionally, time, talent, and treasure. They gave their time, but they also gave their money, right? So there's assumption once you come in that, oh, you know what, you don't really understand it, you don't get it, right? And that's where it actually begins, right? As you come into the institution, you're told that you don't know what you're doing. And so there's this power over, right? That's the other thing too, is I was really glad that Shonali brought up power, is because there's types of power, and that's a whole other panel. But when I think about philanthropy, I usually focus on this issue of power over and power with, right? So there's the opportunity, right? You can lord over, if you will, your grantee partners. You can tell them what to do. You can tell them they don't understand the issue with which they're, grappling every day, right? Because let's be honest, they're really the experts because they're navigating every day. And we oftentimes sit in our office, and Shonali, what you said about, large foundations hiring folks from the communities and actually kind of somewhat, right, we're undermining our grantee partners to a certain extent. Not only are you doing that, but the decisions still come from the US, right? So how does that also impact you? You've undermined your grantee partner with respect, and then the decisions still come. And I've actually talked to program officers, colleagues who have been frustrated that, they tell me, it's like, you know what, we can try to do what we want to, but still decisions still come from the US. Then there's a possibility of power with, right? You can actually have power with your partners, right? When's the last time you actually just ask someone, how can we help you with your strategy, right? Have this really brilliant partnership right now with Ada Williams Prince at the Pivotal Fund, or Pivotal Ventures rather, which is actually a company set up by Melinda French Gates. And one of the things that Ada had the courage to do is tell them, this strategy that you have around women is great, but it's very steeped in a white middle-class woman frame. How about you let me actually engage women of color, and how about we find out what they say the problems are? And I honestly don't think that Pivotal understands how amazing this was. Philanthropy does not usually say, hey, the folks that we want to work with, how about you come and work with us on this strategy? Not only that, how about you tell us what the strategy ought to be? And that's what happened in this partnership. So yeah, there are these, all of that remains. The power over, I can't say that I've been, you know what? Those folks who know me are about, oh Lord, here she goes. There's so much opportunity in philanthropy, particularly in America, but I remain frustrated and concerned because of the issue of power over. Even over the last 2.5 years, there have been, statements and manifestos, and I've had so many conversations where people have asked me to speak with their family office or whomever. But one of the things that I continue to find is that people want to talk and they want to read and they want to listen and they want to write, but they don't want to change their behavior, right? And that's actually one of the key pieces of decolonizing, right? Is to undo again, right? When you you undo the behaviors. And don't get me, it's wrong. It's tough. The work that we've done within More Philanthropy, we've been trying to, and this most recent tranche of funding that we've done, we've been trying to undo behaviors to actually, trust grantee partners and the work that they've already done for decades in some cases, and say, you know what, we just want to actually fund you and invest in you in a way that actually helps sustain you. But we also found ourselves doing the same, right? Creating the same behaviors. And, my program officer told me one day, she said, Yvonne, we're not doing site visits because, we're actually talking about trust-based philanthropy. We're basing it on the record that they've already created. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. And so for everyone, including, right, Black woman, South Asian woman, my program officer, we also have a challenge of undoing, right, all the things that we've been doing traditionally. So it's work, but it's also exciting. So I'll stop there so we can keep it going. Thank you,
Okay.
Andrew.
Just let me come back to you, Yvonne, on that. And you're saying it's behaviours. So where does it start? It's one thing to sort of realise you need to change your behaviour, but how do you go about it? What sort of work do you do with clients? What do you recommend them to do?
You know, depending on the client, it actually takes time. It's so funny because this issue of language is very important to me. I talked to this about Urvi about this. Language is so very important. I usually start with philanthropy so that you can actually remember that the work you're doing is about love, right? It sounds hokey, it sounds woo-woo, but it really is, right? We're talking about love, right? And so if you can't decolonize, how about you just treat someone with love? I mean, you can decolonize, but if that overwhelms you, how about you just start by treating someone with love? And so, right, it's listening to them, right? That's one example, is to actually listen and not listen to respond, but listen to hear them. The other thing is, how about you trust them? And when I say trust them, if they tell you this is what's going on in my community, how about you trust them? How about you go visit and let them explain that this is what they're talking about? You know, I mean, and I would actually encourage people to look up the definition of love. I'm a woman of faith, and I've actually looked at the definition from multiple faiths. And, you know, if you don't like, you know, if you're not a person of faith, whatever denomination that might be, I always go to bell hooks, right? But I think because behavior, I think, first of all, Andrew, you have to be willing and wanting to learn what the behavior change is. Right? You have to actually be willing to trust me when I tell you, right? Trust a Black American woman who's actually been doing philanthropy in the institutional section for 22 years. And then I came to this sector having already done philanthropy since I was, 6 or 7. So you have to trust me when I tell you something. I'm sorry, I think I had creating background noise. I would tell people to just listen, not to respond, and listen to learn, and then see where that takes you. I think if someone's been doing a particular, work, or they've been an activist or a leader, how about you trust them and trust what they're saying? When it comes to your investment, you can start out small and you can continue to do your own learning, right? Those are just some practical things. You can talk to colleagues who have actually already begun to engage in decolonizing, right? They can talk to you about the challenges that they've experienced, right? Someone has done it. That's one of the things in philanthropy I always find, that we sometimes think that we're the first to do something magnificent. I hate to tell you that you probably are not, but that's okay, because whoever's done it before you can actually be a resource for you. So maybe just those two things. I don't want to overwhelm people.
Great, thanks, Yvonne. That's great. Thanks for stressing the importance of listening as well. That's terribly important. That's great. Let's move on. I'm going to now bring in Urvi Shiram. Urvi leads the Centre of Philanthropy for Social Justice at the Indian School of Development Management. She's responsible for driving the Centre's research and engagement agenda on improving the well-being of vulnerable communities by strengthening the knowledge and practice of social justice philanthropy. Her research on philanthropy has been featured at international conferences and the national media in India. Prior to this, she led a research initiative with the Research Triangle Institute to promote social mobility for underprivileged in India. An economist by training, she's been a frequent speaker at the Global Economic Symposium. She also participated in the India Leaders for the Social Sector Programme in 2019, and more recently, the Executive Education Programme of Strategic Philanthropy at the Cambridge Judge Business School. There's that name coming up again. Urvi, we're delighted to have you here again. Please do come and...
Thank you. Sorry, Andrew, are you saying something? You're on mute.
I was just saying, just to introduce you and tell us about you and how decolonisation plays into it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It's been such a fabulous learning experience working with the Alliance magazine and, delving into issues of power and change and philanthropy in different parts of the world. I'm absolutely thrilled to be participating in this very timely discussion, especially as Independent India just turned 75 last month. And over the last month, many have been quoting our first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's iconic Tryst with Destiny speech, which he had given on the eve of India's independence after 2 centuries of British colonial rule. There's a lot of introspection going on since then, invoking several mixed emotions. Development over the decades has ensured food, water, clothes, electricity, etc. A lot of things that we can laud ourselves for. But there's also at the same time a debate going on whether enough attention is being paid to that section of his speech that calls for independent India creating its own social, economic, political institutions which ensure justice, which ensure ending of inequality of opportunity for every person, and to truly create a progressive nation. So this whole work on decolonizing philanthropy and what we're doing at the Center of Philanthropy for Social Justice is so, deeply tied together. Our main aim at the center is really to build a community of change makers for systemic change and really become a hub of actionable knowledge on philanthropy for social justice. And the end objective is really, to work together with the ecosystem on transforming the way philanthropy is leveraged towards creating a more effective social sector, which has a shared vision of a just, equitable, and humane society. So that's what we're doing at the center. And as I've been working on this issue and reading a lot about decolonization, reading the articles from various people from all across the world, I've realized how the two are totally tied. And Andrew, you asked me to pen down a couple of key elements, what I think are important in both. And whenever, over the next 30 minutes or so, I would love to talk about that as well.
Thanks very much for that, Urvi. I just wanted to ask you, given India's sort of colonial history and background, I mean, that's kind of overlaid on a sort of a traditional caste system as well. I mean, what kind of challenges are you coping with when you talk about decolonizing philanthropy?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So yeah, philanthropy has been ingrained in Indian culture and tradition since really ancient times. And over the decades, it's had a huge influence in shaping modern India, some leading institutions, and establishing a vibrant non-profit ecosystem. So in fact, right now, many believe that this is the golden age of philanthropy, with massive growth in wealth and increases in both the quantity of private sector funding as well as there is a trend towards diversification in its approaches and practices. But our research and whatever limited data that is available, it is showing that despite all these developments in the sector, there remains a stark gap between the giving potential and the needs of some of the historically marginalized communities. And I guess closing this gap requires moving away from some of the patriarchal forms of giving. And the good part is that there is optimism at the moment about how philanthropy, by reshaping some of its role, can play a critical role in moving to a more equitable and justice-based development paradigm. So I think the first challenge or opportunity, when it comes to decolonizing philanthropy and the issues that the country faces because of the historical, caste system and the injustices which have prevailed for a while now, is just the ability of philanthropy, ability and willingness of philanthropy to acknowledge that meaningful social change and historical injustices need historical shifts in power structures, in institutions, in policies, and in systems. The communities and the group of people that have been most adversely affected by social inequities need the empowerment. They need their voices, to be included in decision making for any meaningful social change to happen. And what this means in practice is philanthropy really working with their grantees, working with communities towards long-term social transformation through trust, through partnership and flexibility. It means philanthropists, foundations, family offices being open to practices like inclusive governance, soliciting and acting on feedback from their partners, and being open to giving without necessarily controlling the process. And there are some promising examples that we're seeing of this kind of an approach in India, like Mr. Azim Premji, whose name has become synonymous to philanthropy, Rohini Nilekani, who's working on co-creating the governance structures with the communities to help them build their capacities. Secondly, I think, again, a challenge or an opportunity is that philanthropy can play a large role if it is ready to challenge some of the traditionally favored mechanisms and support innovative solutions to some interconnected systemic issues that affect population groups despite the legal protections and policies. So data and evidence has shown that inclusive social impact has been achieved very well by grassroots movements, but philanthropy tends to stay away from backing such social movements. So I think decolonizing philanthropy calls for a greater support for social movements, for some right-based approaches, for community-based philanthropy models that have the intermediaries and the end beneficiaries as being part of the solution. And in practical terms, maybe collaboration among like-minded groups and philanthropic and civil society networks can perhaps mitigate some of the risks that individuals or individual organizations believe are associated with supporting these social movements. And I think thirdly, and this is what we are hearing in our research from many of the progressive funders, it means supporting organizational development and capacity building of grantees so that they're able to create the sustained change that they aspire to, and not just provide programmatic funding, which often leads to more short-term results or is largely focused on enabling delivery of essential services, let's say in rural areas. I mean, this project-based or output-oriented approach has its own importance, especially in a country like India, but it may not necessarily lead to the structural shifts that benefit, the entire communities. So organizations that are working at the front line on deep-rooted issues of patriarchy, feudalism, caste, need long-term support from funders. So I think we are at a very, critical juncture, at least in terms of Indian philanthropy, as we are building back better after the pandemic. The many, many movements for racial equity, transparency, shifts in philanthropic priorities in several Western countries are now sparking conversations and action here on how to broaden the centers of power within philanthropy, within the philanthropic sector and the society. How do we really develop norms of accountability, so that philanthropy can play an even greater role in, redeeming the pledge that was made 75 years ago by Nehru to make all the people of the country what destiny intended them to be. And we at the center are just at the beginning, of this very long journey ahead, and we are learning and unlearning as we are talking to practitioners and people with more lived experiences in this field. But I'm really, really happy, excited to be, engaging and participating in this conversation and on how we can, take all this theoretical, conceptual knowledge and how can we convert it into action on the ground. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Urvi. There's lots of fascinating stuff there. But I'm going to move on to Dr. Jessica Sclair, who's our final panelist. Jess is a lecturer in the School of Business and Management and a fellow of the Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at Queen Mary University of London, a post that she's just taken up. Her areas of research include foundation philanthropy and impact investing in Brazil, financialization and the private sector in international development, and the role played by philanthropy in inheritance and business succession processes. She's currently also working on a collaborative research project exploring the UK government's engagement with for-profit international development consultants and contractors in the spending of official development aid budget. In partnership with Dr. Fawaz Sial at the European Network on Debt and Development, Jess is also working on a further project exploring the adoption of innovative financing mechanisms by philanthropic foundations in the Middle East. Her recent book, Brazilian Elites and Their Philanthropy, Wealth at the Service of Development, is published by Routledge. Jessica, I think that's the part of your work you're going to focus on today, I think. I'm right in saying, is that correct?
That's right, yes.
Great. So tell us, I mean, what are you seeing in terms of Brazil is an old colonial country, but no longer is. Do you see those attitudes still being perpetuated among sort of Brazil's wealthy elite?
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew, and also huge thanks to my fellow panelists here. It's been so great hear you all speak about this topic, which is so important. And like Yvonne said, great that there's so much interest in this. So Yvonne said that we need to kind of understand where everything begins in relation to this. And Urvi, you also talked about the kind of historical roots of colonialism and how that feeds into philanthropy. And I wanted really to pick up there if I could, and then I'll move on. One thing that I think is I wanted to say before I started is that when I'm talking here, I'm really talking about philanthropy of the wealthy and foundation philanthropy. And I think it's really important that we make that distinction, because of course we know that people with less money actually do a lot more philanthropy relative to their income than the wealthy do. And yet when we talk about philanthropy, we do tend to focus on philanthropy of the rich, and those are quite different practices, I would say. So I'm talking here about foundation and philanthropy of the wealthy. So I think that to start really thinking about decolonizing philanthropy, we need to first understand that the colonial legacies that we see in philanthropy take lots of different shapes and forms. And that's connected to the fact that the real legacies of colonialism more broadly are found actually in these really deep-rooted forms of inequality that are at the basis and are seen throughout our whole current global capitalist system, I would say. And these are inequalities, as we all know, that are deeply racialized. They're also class-based and economic, and they're also deeply gendered. And all of those things are really connected and go hand in hand with each other. And that's because the colonial project itself worked on all of those fronts simultaneously. That's why it was so powerful and destructive, and why its legacies are so deep and long-lasting. And I think the other thing that we also need to recognize and talk about more openly is that most philanthropy, and again, here I'm talking about foundation philanthropy, most philanthropy is practiced by the heirs of this colonial project, who are the current global elite. And philanthropy is also carried out by them using funds that have their roots very often in and their origins in the kind of colonial history that I've just been talking about in lots of different ways. So if we're really going to decolonize philanthropy, the starting point needs to be one of recognizing how these colonial histories endure in the current relations that we see on the ground of racism, gender prejudice, class injustice, and other kinds of repression, and the different ways that these find themselves into philanthropy and the ways that it's practiced, or sometimes also as importantly, the ways that philanthropy fails to address these issues in the kinds of work that philanthropists choose to do. And Shonali talked a little bit about this earlier, I think it's really important. This is absolutely about relations between the global north and the global south, but it's also about relations of inequality in countries. And I've been both countries in the north and countries in the south. And philanthropy therefore needs to be decolonized within countries as much as it does in the philanthropy that takes place between them. So coming in now to your question about Brazil, I think this is definitely the case in the Brazilian context. We need to remember that Brazil only abolished slavery in 1888. It was one of the last countries in the world to do so. And the structures of inequality that we see in Brazil today are born directly out of this colonial history. And talking again about the Brazilian context, I think there's two important starting points for how we actually go about thinking about decolonizing philanthropy. Firstly, I saw someone in the chat box mention this, and I think the panelists have also touched on this. I think making reparations for colonial history is really essential. And the way that I think we need to do that is by passing money directly to the grassroots organizations that are really working on these topics. So Aline Andrade Silva and Graciela Hopstein have written a fantastic article in this issue of Alliance about philanthropy in Brazil, and they point out, and this is really key in the Brazilian context, that most Brazilian foundations are still principally operating foundations. There's very little, still comparatively, very little direct grant making that takes place domestically in Brazil, where Brazilian philanthropists are just giving money directly to the civil society organizations and social movements that are working grassroots to address the colonial legacies that we're all talking about around race, social and economic inequality, human rights, indigenous rights, and of course climate change, which is also deeply connected to the history of colonialism through extractivism and other forms of ecological exploitation. Important to recognize in Brazil that there are shifts in the right direction. I think in the same way that Urvi was talking about in India, we have seen in recent years in Brazil a kind of movement towards more local grant making, in particular through the work of the Brazilian Philanthropy Network for Social Justice that Graciela and Aline are both part of and talk about in their article. So shifts are taking place in the Brazilian landscape, but they're really slow. They're too slow. And as Shonali and Urvi also mentioned in their introductory article, and Yvonne also you touched on earlier, this grant making to grassroots organisation needs to be trust-based. It's got to be for core costs. It's got to be given with no strings attached. These organisations know much better than the philanthropists. We all know this and we've said it a million times, but it's so hard, it seems, for philanthropists to actually do this. These organisations know how philanthropists just need to give it to them and let them get on with it if they're really serious about seeing change take place. But in a way, I think that although that process of what I'm calling repatriation, although that's challenging, in a way, that's actually the easy bit. Because I also think that if philanthropists are really serious about decolonising their work, they also need to turn the gaze back onto themselves and think about how their own wealth is made in the first place. So that means thinking about how these deep forms of inequality, those created during and then persisting beyond the colonial era, have actually enabled the wealthy to make their money in the first place. And how that accumulation of wealth helps actually to keep those structures of inequality in place today. So turning the gaze inwards like this might mean philanthropists looking very seriously at their own practices, their corporate practices, their investment practices, really importantly, and asking what are the impacts of those practices on their employees, on communities, on the environment, and also who's being consulted, who gets to say what those impacts are. Like Yvonne was saying, whose voice is getting heard in terms of assessing what we see in those processes. Now, of course, that turning the gaze inwards thing is much more difficult. It's much more radical and long term. And one of the things that's difficult about it is that if wealthy philanthropists are really going to engage in doing that, they may well end up less wealthy and therefore less able to do philanthropy. But then it might also mean that there's less need for philanthropy at all in the long term. So I think I'll stop with that thought and hand back to Andrew in the Q&A, because I'm looking forward to everyone's questions.
Thanks, Jess. Just one very quick thing that I noticed in we were talking earlier, or something you'd written, that you see impact investing as really a way of reinforcing the status quo. And that's interesting because a lot of people are now seeing, especially in Asia and in the sort of developing world, impact investing is seen as the sort of flavour of the month. You just say a couple of words about that, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a huge topic that I won't be able to do justice in the time that we have. But my broad take on impact investing, and I've been doing quite a lot of work around this, is that impact investing is based on this kind of great idea that investors could make profit while they're creating social change. But in reality, that is just incredibly difficult, and it doesn't really work, because really big profit making is exploitative. Yeah, it doesn't lead to the kind of social change that we need to see. So what often ends up happening in impact investing in social businesses and in bottom of the pyramid schemes is that we kind of narrow the definition of what social impact means to business ideas that do make a profit. And that ends up kind of skewing the social change part. So and the other problem with it is that it's based on this idea that we don't need to look at the creation of wealth in order to understand why we get enduring forms of poverty and inequality in all the different ways that I've just been talking about. And actually, if we think about, we talk about a poverty line, but we very rarely talk about a wealth line. And I believe those two things are connected, and that it's going to be very difficult for us to resolve the kinds of issues that we're talking about today without tackling inequality and thinking about how those at the top are connected to those at the bottom. So coming back to impact investing, I think the problem with impact investing is it doesn't tackle those questions. And we end up working with forms of or definitions of what impact means that keep enabling the wealthy to get richer and richer, and that actually the kinds of really deep-rooted social change and shifting of power and tackling of inequalities are not money making. They're not. They can't be. They don't work like that because they're not compatible with the capitalist system in those ways. So I think really transformative philanthropy of the type we're talking about sits more with grant making to civil society organizations that don't need to worry about turning a profit at the same time.
Great, thanks, Jess. Let me go to the Q&A and see what's I'll just come back. Sorry, just bear with me, people. I'm a bit of difficult to pick up the let me pick up a question here from which talks about the role grantees can play in challenging philanthropists to make progress towards decolonizing philanthropy. Any thoughts on that? Shonali, could you comment on this and just say what do you think about
Sure. Yes, of course. And I can probably, I've been keeping an eye on some of these questions, and I think, I can probably hybridize a couple of responses, because this is actually a really fantastic question about the role that grantees can play. Just to give a little bit of a context to this from my own research, during my PhD, but also from my work with a crowdfunding platform called Global Giving. There was a time when, one of my colleagues there, she was in, I believe, Liberia, doing field assessments and, M&E for various projects. And so, the whole concept of crowdfunding platforms is the idea that organizations can raise money for the things that they really want funded, rather than, just, going for the whims of the donors. And so this is just a little example to show, kind of the mentality that's been entrenched in grantee organizations, grassroots organizations, mid-size community-based organizations, et cetera. So my colleague, she said that when she went to the organization, said, if you're joining the platform, if you had a pot of money, what kind of project would you fund? Just to see, like, if you had unlimited funds, unlimited access, there were no barriers. And her response, the representative from the NGO was, well, I don't know. We'll make a project based on what the donor is funding. And that just, I'm going to pull my hair out, right? This is just, and I think probably a lot of people that on this webinar are going to pull their hair out. But I bet we can all think of a dozen organizations off the top of our heads that will have to exist in this mentality and this, this very disempowered ecosystem that has been created, which is why I think, and this touches on a few different questions, but particularly this, what's at the root of the question about, how can we get grantees to be able to advocate for this? So the thing is that in a lot of cases, there are grantees that do have great relationships with their donors. And I think, when you have those relationships, if they are based on some form of mutual trust, maybe it's not as trusting and as localized as we would all like it to be, but if you actually are from a grantee organization that has a seat at the table, are your donors actually doing needs assessments with you? Are you able to actually share, great, we're funding this project, but actually really the need is this other project, and you feel like your donors are going to listen? Use that, leverage that, train other grantee organizations in your space on how to be able to do that. Like, let's, create more of these kind of mutual networks on the ground, and really, because so much from a grantee's perspective, so much of it is about competition, right? Funding is drying up. We're actually working against other organizations in our field because we're all applying for the same pots of money. So I think, actually, at the end of the day, grantees can find themselves in a really empowered position, but not if you're sort of in this. It's difficult if you've been kind of chronically, over the years or over the decades placed in this position where you have to shift or, kind of realign your goalposts based on what the donor is funding. So I think, if you're an organization that feels like you really would like to be able to advocate to donors, see if you can get together with your team and think about, what are ways that we actually already have some power. Let's not look at it as a situation of we're constantly, this bad language around beneficiaries. We're not just beneficiaries. What are ways that we actually have power? How can we leverage that? Sometimes it might be a brute force approach. Sometimes it needs to be done very diplomatically and very gently. But have a think about what types of power you already have within your organization to advocate for yourselves. So that's my, I think that hopefully that touches on a few different questions, because I do appreciate we probably won't get to all of them.
You know what, Andrew, I want to say something, and Shonali, I so appreciate what you're saying, but here's the thing. This is when I get angry, because grantees, partners should not have to do all of that.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right.
No, and you're correct, because I definitely believe in leverage and grantee partners leveraging power, because I try to help mine do that on a daily basis. You're absolutely right, but you remind me that this is exactly what decolonization is about. Grantee partners are already doing all this work, and then we're now making them do exactly what Shonali was just talking about. It is ridiculous.
It is.
This is what it means to do power. This is what it means to let go of power. We're still having the general operating support, core support conversation. It's 50 years. Because I've been in philanthropy 22 years, and my professor and mentor said that about it 25 years before. This is so unfair. This is what decolonization looks like. That grantee partners do not have to do that. Sorry, that was a little bit, but you know what?
I completely agree with that. I think probably we all do.
I appreciate you sharing that, because I appreciate you sharing that, because it's a perfect example of what is like. This is what decolonization looks like. That they should not have to do that.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Can I just move on to another question here? If we define and measure philanthropy in a colonial/Western way, then we will find colonial philanthropy. What will we find if we value and measure the giving that happens in every community? That's from Emma Beeston, the UK-based philanthropy advisor. So Yvonne, perhaps I can come to you on that.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was trying to go through the questions, and I saw that one. And one of the things that we're actually trying again, and mix, it's hard, is again this last tranche of funding where we're trying to actually base this all around trust-based philanthropy, using that term, is we're actually asking the grantee partners to tell us what your levels of measure, right? What does success look like for you? Because we're not experts in the areas in which we're funding, right? So we're telling them, what does success look like for you? Send us your 3 outcomes, and then we're gonna come back to you and and talk to you about the success or the failure, not in a bad way, of those items. It's if I've worked in water, yeah, but I'm not a wash expert. So someone working in wash, how about you tell me what? Because philanthropy. Let's be honest, we don't always know what success looks like for us. That's a myth, right? Many foundations and many donors have not done that analysis in a way that can really say, this is what impact and success looks like for. So actually, how about you ask your grantee partners what success looks like for them, and then come back to them at the end of the year or whenever, and talk to them about how that worked. And if there are other ways that you can help them, another investment to help them move forward. But yeah.
Great. I'm very sorry to say that time is moving on. So what I'm going to do is come to each of the panel in turn for a kind of last reflection. Urvi, can I start with you in this case, do you think? What do you take away from this discussion, and what do you take away from the things you've seen as guest editor of the Alliance issue?
Well, to be honest, I think it is sometimes a bit overwhelming to look for answers to such daunting issues, and sometimes to even start a conversation around them, because philanthropy, especially by individuals, families, is inherently believed to be voluntary, private, personal, up to one's own discretion. You decide where you want to donate, who you want to donate to. But it is just so critical for philanthropy to consider, its role, its obligations, and its, opportunities and role in the society, and its duties to the public. So I think all I can say is I just feel privileged sitting here and having this conversation. And I think the challenges are very complex, and we need to think and work together to find promising pathways forward. And as an aspiring philanthropist and a passionate researcher on this topic, I'm really, really particularly excited about seeing, how some of these concepts and new ways of thinking are embraced by the new age philanthropists, and the impact that they'll have in India and the world's development story. And I think participating in such dialogues and engaging with the community is a great way to learn about best practices and tap into our collective power of the sector. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Urvi. Jess, can I come to you for your takeaway, your word of wisdom, whatever you want to call it?
Sure, I know we're really running out of time. I just want to say that I think the thing I hear most strongly here, and that I totally agree with, is that this really, the way to start moving forward on this is around trust-based philanthropy. And trust-based philanthropy just means that. It means let go of the money, let trust the organizations that are working at the grassroots of these issues to do what they need to do with it. And we need to help philanthropists to lose the fear of just doing that. I think that's really the first, most important step forward.
Great, thank you very much. Terrific. Lose the fear. Shonali, quickly to you, please. Oh, we've lost Shonali. Yvonne, can I come to you for a quick reflection, please?
Yeah, sure. I think, oh, Shonali's back.
I'm back. Sorry about that. I realized I was on mute this time. No, but the only thing I wanted to say before we go to you, Yvonne, is that, for me, it's about exactly what Jessica was saying. If you're from a donor organization, the question not is what do I want to fund? What do I believe in as a philanthropist? What does my CSR fund believe in? The question is, what do you need? What do you need? How can I help? How can you get from point A to point B? And if you are part of an organization that is not asking that question, that's the first step. That's the first step that's my key takeaway. What do you need and how can I help you get there? So I'll leave it there for Yvonne.
Great, thanks, Yvonne.
Yeah, I just, thank you all again for today. I know sometimes I'm overly passionate, but I don't apologize for that. And I really appreciate the passion that all of us are sharing, and it's needed. I think, one of the people in the chat asked about about how to do it, how to do this work without having to use the language. Just focus on the actions. You can bring the language later. Focus on the actions and bring the language later.
Great, thanks very much to all of you. I'm sorry to say we're virtually out of time now. I'm sure we could have gone on and talked for another hour about this. Lots of questions we haven't got to, and I'm sorry to the people who asked them some really good questions there in both the chat and in advance. Well, I better wrap up. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion and you found it helpful and engaging. I certainly have. Don't forget you can qualify for your 20% discount on an online subscription using Event 22. So just let me say thank you to everyone, to our expert panelists, to Mercer, our sponsors, and to the Alliance team, especially Amy McGoldrick, who's kind of handled the logistics, has done the back office stuff and is in the background, but very prominent in organisation. And thanks most of all to all of you for listening. That's it from me. Goodbye.